inferiority, both mental and spiritual, and the fact that slaves were treated as chattel and subhuman property, that I described in the Episcopal Church the evangelization and Anglicanization of slaves as conditional. I further point out that because the emancipation, when it came, could change laws, but not necessarily hearts, the descendants of slaves had to contend against the legacy of the institution of slavery, even though slavery itself was no longer the law of the land. Willard Gatewood, in his book called The Aristocrats of Color, observes that white Episcopalians exhibited a racism that prompted them to treat their black brethren as stepchildren separated from the main body of the flock. This principle held true in the establishment of slave chapels on plantations, in the creation of pre-Civil War parishes such as St. Thomas's, Philadelphia, St. Philip's, Harlem, St. James, Baltimore, and St. Luke's, New Haven, and in the proliferation of colored missions spawned in the wake of emancipation. Virtually all of these congregations, it must be remembered, were founded by white parishes or by black members of white parishes who struck out on their own, efforts which the white power structure was all too willing to underwrite. But it would be a mistake to believe that such acts of munificence were motivated by a desire to empower blacks. To the contrary, they were exercises of control. For instance, although Bishop Onderdonk of New York heaped fulsome praise on the Reverend Peter Williams for his accomplishments as rector of St. Philip's, Harlem, he was quick to remonstrate against the Negro rector when that rector took a stand in favor of abolition and against colonization. Colonization, of course, was the idea of sending blacks back to Africa, because it hadn't been in the first place by that point. But the idea was, it's amazing how the church was like a chameleon in its theological formulations. It developed a formulation of theology that said they justified slavery by saying we were bringing these heathen to these shores in a civilized country to get Christian indoctrination. That was a good thing. But then when slavery was over and there was no use for blacks anymore, they developed another theology. And that is that now that they had been enlightened with the light of the gospel, they should then take that light back to their heathen cousins in Africa, you see. So there was a story, a justification for sending slaves both west and east. So, anyhow, Bishop Onderdonk demanded that Williams at St. Philip's should, quote, preach merely the gospel without interfering with the political affairs of the time. And nothing, perhaps, is more telling than the desire to maintain blacks as stepchildren than the fact that the church was reluctant in diocesan conventions to admit black parishes into communion with them. The people of St. Thomas's waited 68 years for that privilege, and St. Philip's flock were in the holding pattern for 34. There was a long debate on the floor of the diocesan convention in New York, and at one point somebody got up and said this, but this cannot prevent our seeing the fact that they are socially degraded and are not regarded as proper associates for the class of persons who attend our convention. We object not to the color of their skin, but we question their possession of those qualities which would render that intercourse with members of a church convention useful or agreeable even to themselves. It is impossible in the nature of things, that such opposites should commingle with any pleasure to either. Now, despite such fits and starts, there was in the years leading up to the Civil War an increase in the number of black Episcopalians on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. This was the case according to George Freeman Bragg. George Freeman Bragg was the rector for many, many years of St. James, Baltimore, and a historiographer of black Episcopalians. He said, although northern blacks, many of whom worshipped in the slave galleries of white parishes, quote, suffered under the benign neglect of their bishops, and Southern blacks lived under the paternalistic control of their bishops. Don't talk about a rock and a hard place. Growth among black Episcopalians in the North often took place because of the indefatigable efforts of black priests and lay catechists and the support of prominent black laypersons. In the South, the sometimes exponential increase of black communicants was attributable to the proliferation of black separate congregations under white control. The colonial church adopted the English system of parish churches, and in England, even to this day, a parish is a geographical area. You claim everybody in that area. But so separate congregation has no geographical bounds. It was just a church established in the bounds of an existing parish. But while numbers were high, morale was low, and black Episcopalians, by and large, were not made to feel that they were an integral part of the Episcopal Church. And since religious instruction, especially but not exclusively in the South, was seen as part and parcel of an oppressive system, and missionaries regarded as little more than their masters' ecclesiastical counterparts, little incentive was provided for blacks to remain in the Episcopal Church. Emancipation, understandably, effectively removed such incentive as there was, inasmuch as it caused, in the words of George Goodman Bragg, a wholesale exodus of colored people. In his sermon at the centennial celebration of St. Thomas's, Philadelphia, which of course was founded by Addison Jones, in 1892, Henry Codman Potter, the Bishop of New York, told the congregation this: "I do not think it would have been very strange if the colored race, after it had been freed, should have refused to follow the white people's God. It shows a higher order of intelligence and an acute discernment in the African race to have distinguished the good from the evil in a religion that taught all men were brothers and practiced the opposite." But the preacher was clearly speaking to the faithful remnant. For after the Civil War, black Episcopalians were few and far between. Hayden reports that the membership of Good Shepherd, Mobile, for example, had dwindled to 9, and even the great St. James, Baltimore, could not boast 50 communicants. The Department of Missions, in its report to the 1877 General Convention, pointed out that whereas in 1860 South Carolina alone could claim more than 3,000 black souls, not even one half of that number could be found after the war in all of the dioceses of the church, north and south. By contrast, the AME Church, 1 year after the Civil War, claimed 75,000 adherents, nearly 4 times as many members as they had a decade before. Explanations for the phenomenon fell into 2 categories: the white and the black. White Southern churchmen attributed the exodus to the antagonism of blacks to white tutelage, the predilection of blacks for a more emotional and less morally demanding religion, and a preference for fellowship with other blacks. Some bishops offered a romantic interpretation of the events. They could certainly turn a phrase. The Bishop of Mississippi, for example, described the rift, quote, as a filial relationship that had been brutally broken, and that blacks stood in the cold, distant, and unsympathetic relationship of hirelings, stripped of those strong claims upon our regard with their late servile and dependent condition justly demanded at our hands. Another Southern bishop, in an address to the 1871 General Convention, put it this way: "The efforts of this diocese in the spiritual improvement of the colored race are not as promising of good results as are desired by the friends of the freedmen. While in some few cases they seem to appreciate the teaching administration of the church, in most cases, listen, they have separated themselves from the ministry of this church and given themselves to the guidance of ignorant teachers of their own race, and are leading them into the wildest excesses of delusion and fanaticism.